Hi everyone, I'm Chidinma and Hope,
I'm Hope Finch.
and today we're presenting the right to assembly. So the human right to assembly. The UDHR states in Article 20 that everyone has the right to freedom of peaceful assembly and association, and no one may be compelled to belong to an association. The ICE-SCR is a binding law that was ratified by 171 countries and stated in Article 21 that the right of peaceful assembly shall be recognized. No restrictions may be placed on the exercise of this right other than those imposed in conformity with the law and which are necessary in a democratic society in the interest of national security or public safety, public order, the protection of public health, or morals, or the protection of the rights and freedoms of others. So there are a lot of conventions and treaties that supported this right. One was the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And so that clarified that no restrictions may be placed on the exercise of this right other than those imposed in conformity with the law and which are necessary in a democratic society, as stated before. The Convention of the Rights of the Child recognizes that the right of the child to exercise their freedom to peacefully assemble. The International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination recognized in Article 5 that all people, regardless of race, have the right to freedom of opinion and expression and the right to peaceful assembly. The European Convention for the Protection of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms say in Article 11 that in addition to addressing that everyone has a right of to peacefully assemble, the convention includes the right to form and to join trade unions for the protection of his interests. And American Convention on Human Rights states in Article 15 that the right of peaceful assembly without arms is recognized, and they also share the same definition as ICE-SCR. So while each of these instruments share a general commitment to the original expression of the right of peaceful assembly, some such as the American Convention on Human Rights seek to clarify how these rights may or may not manifest themselves in practice.
So in order for these declarations and conventions to be more effective, there requires monitoring bodies. In general, the Committee on the Rights of the Child, the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, and the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights all have monitoring bodies to achieve this purpose. They require periodic reports, typically every 2 years. And the reports are evaluated and suggestions for improvements are made and challenges are addressed. Separately from these typical monitoring committees, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights arguably has the most teeth because in addition to this oversight, it has certain mechanisms for redress. So, for example, it serves to provide redress when rights have been violated. This can be achieved by reinstating the right that was violated, of course, or in some cases providing compensation to remedy the abuse. The judgment of the court is final and not subject to appeal. And if the court finds that there has been a violation of a right or freedom protected by this convention, they will, of course, ensure that that right is reinstated, but also, if appropriate, they will determine how to remedy it and that fair compensation be paid to the injured party.
Okay. So we've surmised that the strength of this right is pretty moderate. It has a high ratification of 172 countries that have ratified it. So while the right to peaceful assembly has high ratification rates and has been consistently cross-referenced, in practice it still faces many challenges. For example, some global trends have been identified in different regions with regard to exercising someone's right to peaceful assembly. One is the use of legislation to suppress the legitimate exercise of freedom of peaceful assembly. The other is the excessive use of force to repress peaceful protests. And another is the stigmatization and restrictions targeting particular groups. And contrary to popular belief, Western societies have not stayed true to the right of freedom of assembly. For example, the US, in light of the Black Lives Matter movement, several protesters, journalists, and passerbys have succumbed to excessive force by law enforcement. In addition, during the Dakota Access Pipeline in 2017, anti-protest laws proposed by individual US states prompted two United Nations experts to express their concerns that the bill, if enacted into law, would severely infringe upon the exercise of the rights to freedom of expression and peaceful assembly.
So during our research, we chose the definition that was sourced from the UN General Comment on the Right of Peaceful Assembly. It says that the right of peaceful assembly protects the nonviolent gathering by persons for specific purposes, principally expressive ones. It constitutes an individual right that is exercised collectively. Inherent to the right is thus an associative element. Everyone has the right of peaceful assembly, citizens and non-citizens alike. It may be exercised by, for example, foreign nationals, migrants, whether they're documented or undocumented, asylum seekers, refugees, and stateless persons. The covenant, Article 21 of the covenant really lays out the forms in which protests can take. And in addition, in following elements of the comment, also establish they recognize the right of remote assembly, which is increasingly important in the 21st century, and as the right to assembly takes different forms. So why did we choose this definition? Only one of the definitions truly clarified that the right to protest is protected for citizens and non-citizens alike. While it does say everyone, it was clear to make this more explicit because there could be potential for non-citizens or undocumented individuals to be subject to abuse or have their rights abused. In addition, it was just really the most encompassing definition found and seemed to hit on most of the elements that one would expect to see. Particular aspects and substantive content. The essential elements that reoccur as per the general comment number 37 is peaceful execution of protest. So in order to be protected under international law, a protest must be peaceful. Additionally, a single individual's protest rights are protected despite a lack of association. So even if one individual is protesting, that individual is protected under international law. To reiterate, the right to assembly is not contingent upon citizenship status. Additionally, regardless of prior official coordination, protest is protected. So while protesters often seek to notify the authorities to make necessary preparations, if they choose not to do this, they are still equally protected under Article 21. And lastly, there is a strong presumption in favor of considering assemblies to be peaceful. So to elaborate on this, the UN General Comment says that while there is not always a clear dividing line between assemblies that are peaceful and those that are not, there is a presumption in favor of considering assemblies to be peaceful. Moreover, isolated acts of violence by some participants should not be attributed to others, to the organizers, or to the assembly as such. Thus, some participants in an assembly may be covered by Article 21, while others in the same assembly are not.
So the core principles, one is states shall respect and ensure all rights of persons participating in assemblies. So states must respect and ensure the rights of all individuals. They must ensure rights without discrimination on any grounds. The second, every person has an inalienable right to take part in peaceful assemblies. So this includes spontaneous assemblies, simultaneous assemblies, and counter protests. The state has an obligation to facilitate and protect assemblies, and organizers should not be held responsible for the unlawful behavior of others. The third, any restrictions imposed on peaceful assemblies shall comply with international human rights standards. Freedom of peaceful assembly is a fundamental right and should be enjoyed without restriction. Restrictions may only be applied if they are in the interest of national security and public safety. 4. Force shall not be used unless strictly unavoidable, and if applied, it must be done in accordance with international human rights law. All feasible steps must be taken to avoid the use of force, or, in the case where force is unavoidable, to minimize its harmful consequences. Even if participants in an assembly are not peaceful and as a result forfeit their right to peaceful assembly, they must retain all of their rights. The 5th, every person shall enjoy the right to observe, monitor, and record assemblies. And the 6th, the state and its organs shall be held accountable for their actions in relation to assemblies. So the state bears an obligation to provide to those whose rights have been violated with an effective and prompt remedy.
So in order to better understand international human rights laws, it helps to look at it in the context of the assumed structural features. So for example, universality, the idea that all humans are equal without discrimination. All individuals possess the right to assembly or the right to protest. It's also to some extent inalienable. Rights cannot be taken away except in extraordinary circumstances. For example, the right to protest can be temporarily suspended if there is a larger threat, such as the threat to national security, public safety, or a public health emergency.
Okay.
Additionally, there are interrelated and interdependent rights that seek to strengthen the right to assembly. For example, the Convention on Civil and Political Rights acknowledges that full protection is possible only when other often overlapping rights are also protected, notably freedom of expression, freedom of association, and political participation. In addition, it recognizes that this right is also dependent on the realization of a broader range of civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights. As far as indivisibility goes, in theory, all rights are equally important, though I would argue that in practice, given that the right to assembly can be suspended temporarily in the event of a crisis, such as a public health emergency or a threat to national security, it is not typically seen as equally important when compared to other rights that are necessary to survival, such as the right to food, which cannot be suspended.
Okay. So some cross-cutting norms is non-discrimination and equality rights. So everyone is entitled to the right to peaceful assembly regardless of race, gender, and status. So Article 26 of the ICCPR states that all persons are equal before the law and are entitled without any discrimination to the equal protection of the law. Thus, the law guarantees to all persons equal and effective protection against discrimination on any ground, such as race, color, sex, religion, political opinions, and other statuses. The failure of the state to prevent or take steps in response to acts of discrimination constitutes a breach of the right to freedom from discrimination. Next, participation and inclusion rights. So all persons and groups have an equal right to be present in public places to express their views, and all individuals have the right to belong to an association if they so wish. Everyone has the lawful right to freedom of assembly. It is not necessary under international human rights law or domestic legislation to require advance notification or permission for an assembly. Spontaneous assemblies are allowed. However, it is appropriate for organizers or individuals to inform authorities of their intention to hold an assembly early so that authorities can fulfill their obligation to protect. And counter demonstrations have a right to assemble and express their disagreement with others' views as well. However, each person or group has like a right to express their views undisrupted. Entitlements and obligations. So the obligation to respect rights. There are different kinds. There is the right to participate in protests without prior authorization. As mentioned before, this means the requirement of prior notification must not be confused with requiring permission. The right to choose the content and messages of the protest, next one, means that people can choose the content and message of their protest. The only exception to this is if the person had the clear intention of promoting illegal violence and poses a real risk to people's safety rather than simply expressing their own opinion. The next, the right to choose the time and place of protest. So laws governing freedom of assembly should refrain from administering location prohibitions and schedule timing. Determining the time, place, and manner of a protest enforces restriction of freedom. And the right to choose the mode of protest. So when officials determine the scope of a protest, it doesn't mean that a demonstration is deemed non-peaceful based on a few bad people. Individuals who commit acts of violence in a protest must be singled out on a case-by-case basis. So there's also the obligation to protect and facilitate. For proportionality, law enforcement must assess the level of cooperation or resistance of the person involved, including the level of danger, the attitude of the individual, and the conditions of the surrounding area. The use of force is viewed as a last resort that is intended to prevent more serious occurrences. And lastly, the obligation to guarantee rights. This means the duty to investigate and punish any violation that occurs within the framework of a demonstration. So states have a duty to investigate violations committed within their jurisdiction. They have an obligation to provide effective judicial remedies to victims of human rights violations as well.
So in order to get a better interpretation of how the right to assembly can be interpreted, it's helpful to clarify false claims. So the first false claim is that the right to assembly should be upheld even in the event of a threat to national security. As previously stated, there are exceptions that exist for situations such as a national security challenge or a public health crisis. The second false claim is the right to assembly is granted only to citizens of the state in question. As we previously mentioned, the UN General Comments on Freedom of Assembly establishes that the right to assembly is granted to non-citizens, refugees, stateless actors, everyone. The third false claim is that violence on behalf of one individual classifies the entire protest as violent. As previously stated, it's important to acknowledge that there's not a clear dividing line between assemblies, between peaceful and not. So violent action on behalf of one person should not be attributed to an organization or action on behalf of all individuals participating in the assembly. Lastly, the last false claim is one's right to assembly is upheld even when they have a clear intention of promoting or inciting violence and posing real harm to others. That, as we said, is false. The second, there is the intention of promoting or inciting violence. Those rights are not protected. The right to that assembly is not protected under international human rights law. So that concludes our analysis of the right to assembly.
Thanks for watching.